Congressman Richard Neal represents the 1st District of Massachusetts. Congressman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
The shutdown is carrying on, with Democrats holding firm to their demand that health care subsidies, which expire at the end of the year, be extended, while Republicans are refusing to negotiate until the government reopens. So, Congressman, the stalemate continues. Neither side is blinking at this point. Where are we headed with this?
Well, I think the impasse at the moment is pretty firm, but I also think that there will be an opportunity in coming days, if not the next couple of weeks, as the open enrollment period arrives. And during the open enrollment period, that's when people are going to start getting their premium notices. And we're taking the calls right now. And sometimes the example is that those increases are going to be double plus. And I think I've seen numbers from upstate New York and places like that where the new premium support could mean an additional bill of $23,000. As you might expect, we're paying a great deal of attention to those congressional districts on the other side where the support notices have arrived and the billing is substantially increased. We think that they are more likely to urge their own leadership to want to negotiate. Let's negotiate now. We can't take a one-year extension, but let's discuss where we could be. People should get paid. They're going to work. When you consider the air traffic control employees, they should be paid. They're working. We have the military. They should be paid. They're working. We have people at TSA. They should be paid. They're working. And this grievance that the president has embraced, that he doesn't have to negotiate over these increases in health care subsidies, I think that's about to change.
Should the president be taking a more active role in
No
these
question
talks?
about it. As you know, it's a period of bluster for him. Frequently, the argument changes. There's generally the announcement at 10 o'clock in the morning. There's the walk back at 2 or 3. And then by 7 o'clock, no matter what the issue, there's the declaration of victory. So I think that what's happening at the White House with the Republican senators being invited to lunch, that's really more about superficiality than it is about reality. Many of those states, they're receiving these notices now of the increases. And I think that those senators, they are likely to want to begin negotiation.
You mentioned federal workers going without paychecks, others not working at all. There's also some funding that could potentially dry up for programs like food assistance and Head Start if things aren't resolved soon. Could that add to the pressure that you've already mentioned?
Sure. There's food assistance that could be in real jeopardy come November 1st. And the education department, special services, special needs, those with disabilities, that's going to be impacted. So I think all of these instances are but good examples of why they need to proceed with the negotiation. We are not saying for 1 second that we don't want to negotiate. We're saying increase and give the public a clear understanding of when these subsidies will kick in, and we're prepared to vote to reopen the government.
You mentioned education. There was an article in the Boston Globe this week that said that 190,000 school students in Massachusetts who are in special education programs could be impacted because of potential layoffs with the Department of Education. That's being contested in court right now. But still, if this ends up happening, talk about how not having oversight of special education programs could really hinder the education process in Massachusetts and elsewhere.
Adam, it's one of the great achievements in my legislative time. What we've been able to do to augment from the federal side and from the state side to directly support those families who have children with special needs. It's an extraordinary achievement. When I was going to school, which was a period ago, those children were separated. They had really very little interaction with students who didn't have those same challenges. Today, when you visit the schools, you have to be gratified as to the approach that has taken place. And for those families who struggle every single day, this is unnecessary. Those support services need to continue, and we have to take that quite seriously. I have been a real champion over these years of those who have disabilities receiving equal education. And I think that, again, I can't highlight enough how important that is to legislative life, but more importantly, to what those families have come to expect.
If these cuts were to come to pass, a lot of this falls on the shoulders of the individual states to monitor if special education programs are being administered properly, but not all states have the ability or perhaps even the interest to do that. Is that a concern that there's more things falling on the plates of the individual states, whether it's education or healthcare or things like that?
Well, it's oftentimes you will hear Republicans say that government has gotten too big. And then when you ask them to specify where government's gotten too big, then they have a great deal more difficulty when you put in front of them something like children with disabilities being integrated into our public school systems. And I think that when you ask for that specificity and say to them, well, what would you cut? I think they have a much harder time. They are very good at keeping the argument general, less good at keeping the argument specific.
Shifting gears, the Congressional Budget Office released a report this week that said pharmaceutical companies stand to gain about $8.8 billion from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that passed earlier this year through the possibility of increasing the prices on something called orphan drugs. First of all, can you explain to us what this means? And secondly, what the impact would be on people who are waiting on these drugs and people that are maybe strapped for money?
Well, the bill was big, but it was certainly not beautiful by any objective measurement. In addition to which, I'm really proud of what we did with drug negotiation pricing in the Inflation Reduction Act. I take a great deal of satisfaction. The Ways and Means Committee wrote that legislation while I was chairman, and we proceeded for the purpose of negotiating with many of the drug companies lower prices. And one of the big challenges you always have is at what stage does the generic become available to the consumer? And in many cases, these orphan drugs provide that opportunity. And the generic is after the expiration date of the exclusivity that a company had been granted based upon the initial investment that they had made. But once that expires, then there's an opportunity, I think, for us to do a better job of negotiating. And when this was embraced, the idea was that we would begin with a set pattern, but we would increase the pattern and grow it as we went on. And it's beginning to work. But in that big bill that the president proscribes and seems to take great credit for, which is a giveaway to very wealthy people, incidentally, in that big bill of his, there are those exceptions where many of these drug companies are going to do actually better than they'd anticipated. The recent discussion and announcement, by the way, that was greeted by great fanfare at the White House about Pfizer, when you peel back the onion on that, it's not what it was advertised as being. That's why Pfizer was actually satisfied with the agreement they reached with the Trump administration. Trump made it out to be that there was going to be a radical decrease in prescription drug prices. That's not the case.
Another topic in Washington has been the use of force against boats in the Caribbean, which allegedly have been trafficking drugs. There have been many boats that have been struck. And now some of your colleagues on Capitol Hill want to open hearings about that. Is this an appropriate use of force by the Trump administration, or is this something else that's going on?
Well, we don't know what was on those ships because they were sunk. We don't know who the witnesses were because they're dead. And Adam Smith, who is the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee and a very good friend of mine, I think that his request for hearings on the Defense Committee is appropriate. What you have to understand, I think, with this issue of just arbitrarily killing the people that are on these boats, interdiction would accomplish the same undertaking, but you'd have witnesses. And you could actually mount the boat and find out what was on it before you sink it, and perhaps the evidence is somewhere in the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans based upon these arbitrary determinations that Trump is making. We have no idea how to accumulate evidence here because the evidence is gone. So it's, once again, I think it's this Machiavellian position that he's taken, that he's going to deal with these issues with force, and all it's doing is driving away allies who heretofore we have come to a cooperative agreement on to have them help us. The issue in the end is not just about supply. The issue is about demand as well. And in America, there's a huge demand problem. That has to be addressed simultaneously. But the president's arbitrary approach to this ill serves America's reputation in the world.
Finally, Congressman, I want to go back to Capitol Hill for a moment. Speaker Johnson has kept the House out of session for quite a while now. the government is shut down. What are some things that aren't getting done from a legislative standpoint that should be beyond healthcare and beyond some of the other topics that we've mentioned that maybe we don't hear a whole lot about?
Well, the big issue is the budget, obviously. I think that as it relates to congressional authority, the Constitution is clear as to who undertakes and has responsibility for congressional expenditure. Madison warned about this. Jefferson warned about it. They did not want a king created as that individual determining what spending ought to be like. It's the administration, the president, who makes the request, and then Congress decides whether or not the request is to be well received. So I think that there are probably still 6 appropriations bills that have to be passed, authorized, and passed. I think that is something that comes to mind immediately. But it's the day-to-day issues as well. I was in last week, spent a lot of time there. Some of the small things that aren't happening means that employees are not getting paid. And if you go through even the Capitol, you're reminded about how about those cafeteria workers that have been laid off? How about those people with the bodegas that are just outside of the Capitol? How about the shoe shine repair person who is paid maybe $10 to shine shoes for consumers, for individuals who come to visit the Capitol? And those little shops where people pick up memorabilia, those are people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. They count too. And I think that they are going to have a harder time because they tend to be contract employees as to getting paid down the road. I'm in favor of paying them.